What I wanted to do this afternoon and accomplish is take some time to cover our new upcoming veterinary feed directive and go over how these rules will affect producers and looking at it from the veterinary side, how we view this and really what we're going into. So to just jump into the veterinary feed directive without an understanding of why we're here is a little bit of a big jolt. But if you go back 104 years ago, all we had for infections was arsphenamine, which was an arsenic derivative, just 104 years ago. We went through a huge time of antibiotic development, starting with the discovery of penicillin in 1928, discovery of sulfas in 1935, commercialization and open accessibility to penicillin during World War II with the first use in people in 1942 in the U.S. And then through, about 48, we came up with the tetracyclines. And then starting in the 50s, got almost all of our current antibiotic groups between the early 50s and 1985. Since 1985, human medicine has got 2 additional groups. There's one out there kind of hanging out. We got our last new antibiotic group that we use in food animals in 1978. So we're 38 years into since we got our last new food animal group. The likelihood that we're going to get another new one is extremely slim, right? We did get a new one, villamycin, that works by preventing adhesion or interfering with the fimbriae that allow for E. coli to adhere to the gut wall and cause disease. That one had been out overseas for quite a while. The point is we've got the antibiotics we're going to have, and things that have been driving the issues of more veterinary control over antibiotics used in food animals include some realities and some perceptions. If you have the perception that food animal production is being singled out for blaming antibiotic resistance on the human side and humans aren't doing anything, that's incorrect. Humans are taking some really good advances in it. Just like in veterinary medicine and food animal production, there's a distribution of how people are addressing this and going in that direction. But human health is taking it very seriously, and anytime I talk to someone who's actually on the ground taking care of infectious disease in the human side, we see really eye to eye on what the issues are and how things work. So on the human side, you remember I said in 1912 we would be using an arsenic compound. Now we're back to some cases having to use colistin, which isn't far away from arsenic on toxicity, polymyxin E, and so the battle is taking out the infection or the kidneys, whichever one first. So we've had this huge bloom. In 1985, there were 2 really key things I heard about, statements that I hope to never go down in history as making something like this. I probably already have. One was, we have won the war against infectious disease. We can now move on to other stuff. Hair, getting our hair back. Yeah, I'm good for that. If your HDL, LDL splits bad or your total cholesterol, you're on a statin, right? So the companies have turned to things like that where you take them every day for the rest of your life instead of something that an antibiotic, that just might be real current. So we've said, we've conquered infectious disease. And the other thing was in 1985, the chairman of IBM said the worldwide market for the personal computer is 6 units. You missed that by 7 or 8 billion, probably. I'm sure I'll make some statements that people will be talking about later too. But we went through a phase where we thought we had it completely whipped. In the 50s, we figured out that antibiotics help animals grow faster. And Megan just talked about the microbiota and how this works and how we change distribution of organisms. So we figured that out, and now we've come full circle to January 1. Growth promotion use of medically important antibiotics is no longer going to be allowed in the United States because the labels have changed. So we've done a big circle, came back, and I, as a clinical pharmacologist and a veterinarian, think that we could have done better, right? But looking back, we're not going to fix that. we've done a lot of exposing of bacterial populations to antibiotics, and some of them are more than a little ticked about that. I've got a son who's a survivor of methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. We've got various huge challenges on the human side. You know, on the human side, you get something that aches, a knee or a hip, a shoulder or a heart valve that's not working. What do? You go swap it out, right? We have the technology today that the physicians can fix that for you. We can replace it. What happens to that if we can't control the organisms that might infect you during surgery? So the human side is really, this is really, really a big deal for them. So some of that's driving us into the VFD and into the veterinary control. I can assure you that Dr. Henry and I did not storm Washington demanding this. The veterinary profession did not populate the mall in DC with signs, give us the VFD, right? So in case anyone's going to jump me in the parking lot, don't, all right? So it's, but realistically, we shouldn't think that having the status quo where 97% of the antibiotics by kilogram weight sold in the United States for use in food animals, 97% are over the counter without veterinary interaction. It's not acceptable to legislators, regulators, and frankly, the consuming public. So some people feel that's forced on them. It's not the intention of veterinarians to do that, but I'll tell you what, we need to make the best of that. I think we can, and I think there can be a lot of benefit that comes from that. I know the veterinarians I'm working with on this are looking at this not as an opportunity for captive people who have to pay them to have interaction, but as an opportunity to be involved, and hopefully together we can make a difference. So how much of human resistance are we responsible for? If you look at foodborne pathogens, if human resistance is this, we're about that much of it. A few, some of the infections, a few of the deaths, and not to trivialize those at all, but most people would recognize that when you're looking at Enterococcus faecium in a human hospital, well, Enterococcus, there's some debate, but, or strep pneumoniae, that's not us. The big deal gets back to, again, what Megan's talking about is altering flora out in the environment, in us, and in the animal, and if we could somehow select for resistant organisms that can get through the environment or food that aren't pathogens, populate people, the resistance becomes established in what we call the resistome. It can then pass to organisms that don't directly cause disease, and then when we use antibiotics ourselves, we select for those. So there's a lot of steps that has to happen, and can we ever prove or disprove that? It's pretty hard, and in enters the precautionary principle. And the precautionary principle is well established in regulatory doctrine in the European Union, and it says if we have evidence to tell us or suggest that there's a real problem waiting out there, then we are justified to remove the potential offending practice until it can be shown to be safe. So you switch the burden of proof from innocent until proven guilty to the other way. And trying to prove safety in that something's absolutely safe is it's a non-realistic thing. So is that coming over into the U.S.? I can tell you that regulatory agencies get rather upset with you if you suggest it is. Just, I've heard that. So yeah, it kind of is. And that really is the argument of whether stewardship for people, and there's just an article out suggesting that stewardship on the human side starts with the use in you as an individual, and then the population kind of comes second, where for food animals, our stewardship should be focused on humans still having antibiotics, and the care of our animals comes second. Kind of makes me itch a little bit. I think we have to take care of both. So that's we could go on and on about why we're where we are here today, But I can assure you that how we address the Veterinary Feed Directive is going to be one of the most highly visible things we do as an industry. And how we do is going to determine how the next step goes, and that's prevention and control uses, for which it is very, very clear that the FDA is going to start increased scrutiny on that next year. So we're being watched. So let's start first. I want to tell you what veterinarians are being asked to do, and that's something called stewardship, which we've already mentioned. And stewardship's a really big deal. It's not simple, and I think there's about 5 components. So the first one, and this comes through the VFD and prescriptions, is that the veterinarian's responsible for establishing case definitions and diagnosing what's there. They're responsible for working with you in doing that. It's a 2-person thing. It's a 2-entity thing. So what is it that's causing the problem? How do we say, yes, that is present or not present? So routine necropsies, working with people in the barns to diagnose, that's the responsibility. And then, if there is a disease present, we start to enter this cycle. And the first thing we're being asked, is there a non-antibiotic alternative which will appropriately prevent, control, or treat this disease challenge? Husbandry. My dad graduated from Iowa State University in 1952 with a degree in animal husbandry. And as a lifelong veterinarian, he's told me more than once that the biggest mistake we did was take husbandry out of the name of that degree. Because that's really what we're about. Science is part of it, but we're about being good people in husbandry of those animals. So I think everyone in here would know, for example, that the temperature up here doesn't matter in a nursery, right? What matters is the temperature where the pigs are. Those types of things. The environment of the pig. Is it maximum production or optimal production? Sometimes we may have let the pendulum swing a little too far one way. That's what we're considering. So anything we can do with environment, what Dr. Rowland just presented and the team there, what a great deal. I mean, that's husbandry right there. That's stewardship, to prevent the need for the use of the antibiotics. And that's what we're being asked to do. And if there's no alternative, selection of an antibiotic which has been demonstrated to be safe and effective for this purpose. And I'll call back to your attention, the disease needs to be there for which we're using the antibiotic. If it isn't, that's called habit. And we really have to be sure that that's not going on. And we have to be sure it's effective and it's safe. And then we're assuring use of the antibiotic is shown to be safe and effective. Protocol drift happens, and there needs to be a protocol. Hopefully everyone in here has a protocol for what you're doing. It's good for training. It's good for revisiting. And nothing's a better tool to review what you're doing than having a protocol. Because then you go back and you discuss that and see if you need to change it. And then we're always asking, is this intervention still necessary? And a lot of times when we have that discussion, people start looking down. Yeah, we put that in the feed budget about 3 years ago. We had a problem. Still there? Yeah, it's still there. Is the disease still there? Well, we don't know. We think it might come back. So those are types of things we've got to really look at. And I really hope the VFD rules we're going to go through drives these kinds of conversations. And if they're uncomfortable, that means they're good. Okay. So the VFD Final Rule, how many of you have been to an educational session on the VFD? Excellent. We've got a lot that have, we've got a few that haven't, so we're going to work up through the basics, and we're going to go to some FDA answers to some questions that resulted from the Pork Expo that were submitted. So that's what we're doing, is we are submitting questions to the FDA that they then get together and answer in a unified format so that people aren't out giving different answers on behalf of them. So the VFD directive, the new rule, actually went into effect in 2015. It only affected the drugs that are VFD drugs. The VFD is about the label of the drug. We had a legislator, a national legislator, that was going to repeal the VFD law. Okay, we need to talk. It's not a law. It is a voluntary change of the labels on, by the pharmaceutical companies. So the offer was, in 213, so Guidance 209 said we're going to do this. Guidance 213 said how, and the offer was if companies would open up their labels, take out any growth promotion uses of medically important antibiotics, and put in a requirement for veterinary oversight, the label gets closed back up and there's no looking around while they're in there. Like environmental studies, microbial safety studies. You know, that efficacy study was done about 40 years ago, and $30 million, and 10 years later, your label's still up on the rack. So it was voluntary, so that that other stuff didn't happen. So the only drugs that we have right now, avilamycin, Cobalt is also on there now. Aquaflor is the version of Nuflor for fish that goes in the feed, and of course Palmitil in cattle and swine. We anticipate that the new labels will get rolled out as of the middle here in over a couple weeks in December. They had to be in this last summer, and so we'll be able to see those labels. I know one of the electronic VFD formats will allow veterinarians to start writing VFDs with the new labels the 13th of December so that they can then be automatically put into place January 1. So we're expecting to see those labels out there. Yep, we've talked about that. A VFD drug is a drug intended for use in or on animal feed, limited to use under the professional supervision of a licensed veterinarian. Then it will be on the label. So when you wonder if what I have in my mill, when we get all the new labels out and the old ones used up, it'll be on the label. All right. Feeds. Your milled feed, your total ration. It also includes milk, either waste milk or saleable milk on the dairy, fed to calves. It includes free choice feeds such as minerals. Quite a few things there it includes. Water is different. All of the water medications that are medically important, such as the tetracyclines, the lincosamides, lincomycin, those are going to go to prescription as of January 1. So next time you go to the farm supply store and walk down the aisle, you'll see the medicated milk replacer down there. That's going to require a VFD. You'll see the packets of water-soluble drugs. Those are going to require a prescription. In order for them to still have those on the shelf, they're going to have to be able to accept a prescription, and depending on the state laws, be registered as a distributor or a pharmacy to dispense those. The over-the-counter injectables today will remain over-the-counter. The FDA is, for the first time in writing, said they intend to look at those and consider taking those prescription. I'd say, you know, in the oncoming years, they didn't put a timeline out there. True or false? You can buy penicillin at the feed store, but you need a prescription to use it. It's true because you're not using it at label dose. Anytime you do anything other than the label on an injectable or a water-soluble, you have to have a prescription for that. And it's the veterinarian's responsibility to make sure it's appropriate to use, to fix the dose, and also to assign an exaggerated withdrawal period. Here's one of the biggest things to take home about the Veterinary Feed Directive. The days of using a medically important antibiotic in the feed as you wish, without regard to the label, are done. People go, oh, so it'll be illegal on January 1? No, it's illegal now. Right? The difference is there's going to be a very traceable route of authorization that the FDA will be able to enter into and follow at either the point of use by the client, the point of distribution by the distributor, and the point of authorization at the veterinarian, because everyone will have a copy of what's being authorized. So this isn't gray. This isn't how we get around it. This is your veterinarian's license is on the line. If they write you a VFD that is not exactly as on the label, and the distributors are going to risk a lot of things, such as their feed mill license, if they're a licensed mill, if they fill a VFD that's not legal, or if they do something different than authorized on the VFD, and producers do not want to be caught doing something other than the VFD authorized. So again, in feed a VFD, in water a prescription. So those are approved actually on two different sides, if you will. Water and injectables are what are called dose forms, and feed is separate. And the way we got to no extra label use in the feed was the Animal Medicinal Drug Use Clarification Act was passed in 1994. 1996, the regulations were published, and between that time, the feed manufacturers in this country, through their organizations, talked to the FDA and said, we cannot handle veterinarians write in 40 different ways to put each drug in the feed. It just doesn't work with the mills functioning properly to try to handle all those. So the FDA said, understood, no extra label use in the feed. And that includes any extra label use, either how much is in the feed or indication. Okay, so we've had that. That's been in effect for a long time. So what are these medically important antibiotics? Here's examples. Chlortetracycline, oxytetracycline, tylosin, lincomycin, neomycin. I just realized I don't have a macrolide on there, but tylosin is on there. Tilmycosin, palmitil is on there. Those are all medically important antibiotics. Ones that are medically important, which are injectable only, would include the ceftiofurs, Naxel, Exenolic seed, and then the fluoroquinolones, which the only one you'd be using in swine is Baytril. True or false? Baytril has strep suis on the label. Therefore, you can use it in a paddler pig or one with big joints. No one's going to play anymore because you didn't do so good in the last one. So strep suis is on the label, but only in conjunction with respiratory disease. So it's an illegal extra label use to use that drug for anything outside of the respiratory disease, or now it has the control of colibacillosis on the label, but strep suis is only on there for respiratory disease. Okay. These are ones that are not the ionophores. Of course, these are cattle ones. There's the one for swine. Decoquinate, amprolium, bacitracin, carbadox, mecadox. Those are not medically important. They are not considered medically important for therapy in humans, and so therefore these are not VFD drugs. If they are fed at the same time as a VFD drug, they must be included on the VFD authorization for the drug, and the veterinarian can authorize that they can be fed together. Veterinary feed directive is nonverbal, written only. Written may be manually written or electronic. So if you're running out and you call up and expect the vet to be able to call in a VFD, it's not going to happen. It can't happen by law. It's written only. And this is about 3 times. The written statement authorizes you to obtain and use only in accordance with the uses that are approved. 2 years is how long you must retain a copy at this time. And you must make that veterinary feed directive and any other records available to the FDA at any time upon request. So they do have the ability to see what you're doing. And the veterinarian must be licensed to practice veterinary medicine. that means where the animals are. So the veterinarian writing the VFD must hold a license where the animals are physically located. They must be operating in the course of their professional practice and in compliance with all licensing and practice requirements, including the veterinary client-patient relationship. So what will be on a VFD you'd get? There's going to be the veterinarian's information and your information, the premises at which the animals are specified in the VFD are located, and there's often requests for clarification. So we have the FDA's response to that question, which we'll cover here in a little bit. Approximate number of animals to be fed the VFD feed, the indication for which it's issued, and the level of VFD drug in the feed and duration of use. So for some of the drugs which have, like chlorotetracycline, which has a milligrams per head per day dose, the veterinarian will have to convert that to grams per ton. Only grams per ton goes on the VFD. You'll notice that no longer is it required on the VFD authorization for the veterinarian to indicate how much feed may be dispensed. It's still going to have to be figured out at the level of the distributor, because the distributor cannot dispense more feed than is authorized by this, which is how much. So you're going to have to figure out how much they're going to eat. And I can tell you this, on the swine side, I think everyone is much further along on this than we are on the beef cattle side for some of the veterinarians who haven't been as well in, or as much involved in the actual nutritional aspect of some of these feedlots. But we're getting there quick. And so when I talk to veterinarians, I tell them the first thing they need to do is go home, get with the distributors or feed mills that will be receiving their VFDs, sit down and go through the feed additive compendium together with all the different drugs. And if you have questions as producers, that's a really good idea. When you sit down with your veterinarian about this, go through all the different labels that will be used, make sure you understand the labels, exactly how they can be used, what they can be used for, and that's a good way to start into this process. So the level, the indication, and the approximate number of animals to be fed. And I think we've got a question later about that also. So what this means for you, I'd ask you to be prepared, and I'm asking veterinarians that this isn't an automatic authorization. Remember that stewardship cycle? Veterinarians are being charged with doing that. We're being charged with doing that. Can we use antibiotics in food animals to address diseases, do it safely? You bet we can. Can we do it appropriately? You bet we can. Are there some instances out there that might be habit? Yeah, I'd say there might be. So this is the process that we're going to go through. So about non-antibiotic alternatives, and that good old husbandry term comes back. And I'm not saying we're not being good stewards of the animals or practicing good husbandry, but I'll bet you we can find places to improve, and there's all kinds of new things that are coming out. So that should be part of that should be a routine part of your discussion. Legality, dose, duration, indication, does it match the label? And again, no gray area, and be assured that whatever you do with the feed is going to eventually be inspected someday. That is the big thing that's changed, that in the past, what happened in Vegas stayed in Vegas, right? This is changing. The need for the use, the efficacy of the proposed antibiotic use in relation to your disease challenge, the ability to meet the withdrawal time, and this antimicrobial resistance deal, resistance is real, okay? We do alter the microbial populations of these animals. Does it automatically mean a food safety issue, or even that we're selecting for resistant organisms in the pig or the cow or the whatever? Not necessarily. But we have to realize that just because we haven't seen this or that organism become resistant, that we've only really been using antibiotics in food animals since the 50s. We're 60 or 70 years in. And while that's a lifetime to us, it's a blink of an eye for bacteria. And bacteria take the possum approach to life, and that's live stupid and have lots of offspring, okay? And we always divert right away from before we start talking about universities and stuff like that. We just roll right on with that, away from that. But that's the way they do. It's not that they're intelligent, but they have mutations. They have a lot of them, and we can select for them. And, you know, so one of the big questions is, so if we alter the microbiota or the resistome or all these things we're studying now, don't they just go back? Well, the answer is it depends. For the fluoroquinolones, they've discovered in Campylobacter that the mutation for resistance actually makes them more fit in the environment, so that once you take away the drug, they're still more a better competitor in the environment. We discovered in Denmark that when you pull out all the antibiotics and replace them with copper or zinc, what do you know? They've got heavy metal resistance genes that are on the same plasmids as the antibiotics. There are definitely no free lunches. So I'm not saying the sky is fallen or falling, but I don't want people to think that resistance is a myth and we can do whatever we want without any consequences further on. That's not true either. So here, one more time, they can only authorize what can legally be done. It has to be within the context of a VCPR. In Kansas, we have a state VCPR definition that's accepted by the FDA, so we're under ours. The FDA regulates the manufacture and the label of compounds. So you go through an approval process. There's 8 technical sections that have to be given, submitted to the FDA to get a drug label approved. So they will approve and inspect the manufacturing process, and there's a long, good manufacturing process system they have to go through, and they approve the label. The states regulate the practice of veterinary medicine. So veterinarians with their license obtain that license through the state and practice under the State Practice Act. So when we really start talking about veterinary client-patient relationship, that's really us in the state of Kansas defining that. And there's some things in there about like how often do you need to visit. There is one state that said that should be once a year. The states come out and said that. We don't have that in Kansas. Other states are considering that, mulling it around. But that's the practice of veterinary medicine is regulated at the state level. Now, there's an expiration date and a duration of use. There's 2 time components in the VFD. The duration is how long you are to feed the VFD drug in the feed. If the label says it will be 14 days, it will not be 13, it will not be 15, it will be 14 days. The question has been asked, what if you hit day 14 and there's still probably 400 pounds left on the bottom side of the feed in that bin? What are you supposed to do? The answer is we regret asking that question. Because the defined thing is, well, it should be removed and disposed of properly, which in most states mean either repurposed to another group which has the authorization or is authorized to be fed that under the VFD, which with all the biosecurity implications of that, or it's be disposed of, which in most states means a licensed landfill. That is the official FDA response on that. So the duration, if it says up to 21 days, it can be fed whatever the veterinarian authorizes on the VFD, but that is what has to be fed, what the veterinarian says on the VFD, up to 21 days. If it says 21 to 42, it may be fed anywhere in there where the veterinarian authorizes it. Okay, that's the duration. The expiration is how long the VFD is good for. So if it's on the label, that's the maximum time the veterinarian may write that for. Palmitil, 90 days, right? If it's silent, the veterinarian may write it for up to 6 months to be effective. Up to 6 months. They may pick any duration they wish. So the expiration is how long the VFD is good for. The duration is how long the drug is fed. The complete duration of the drug feeding must be accomplished while a valid veterinary feed directive is in effect. So if that VFD is going to run out halfway through, you need to get another VFD in effect to finish feeding that drug. So what you'll find is if you're using these drugs systematically or want to have the ability to use them throughout the year, you will work with your veterinarian and have a standard time that you get them reissued. So your responsibility as a client to adhere to the VFD exactly how it's to be fed. You can't feed after the VFD expires, and provide a copy of the VFD when requested by inspectors, and maintain a copy for 2 years. So all medically important antibiotics used in the feed will require a VFD. That includes medically important antibiotics which have transitioned to a VFD label that you purchased and possessed prior to January 1. If it's on your farm and you're going to feed it and it is moved to a VFD label, you must have a VFD in place to feed that. So here's a little nuance that's confusing some, is that the VFD is about medicated feeds. Medicated feeds are type B premixes and the final type C feed. A type B premix may contain up to 100 times the concentration of the drug as will be in the final type C feed and contains 25% nutrients. Type A's are medicated articles, not medicated feeds. So a type A is outside of the veterinary feed directive. There's two types of categories of type A. So an example of a type A would be a 90 milligram per pound chlorotetracycline, or 50. Those are going to be a category 1, is for our information, as far as we know. So it may be purchased and used without a feed mill license. If it's a category 2, again using Palmitil as an example, the type A Palmitil may only be purchased and used to mix by a licensed feed mill. CTC is going to be a category 1 type A. It may be purchased without a VFD. It may be possessed without a VFD, but you must have a VFD to feed it. Right. So just because you can get a type A category 1 on the farm without a VFD, you can go out and sit on it. You can have parties on it. You can put a tablecloth on it, candles, invite people over, and you go, wow, you got a lot of type A. Yeah, I do. I collect it. All right? But before you do anything with it, you've got to have a VFD to do that. All right? It's very, very important people understand that. And that's because of the definition of feed. And again, we know that. And so water medications, your veterinarian may prescribe an extra label use adhering to the Animal Medicinal Drug Use Clarification Act regulations, which require a lot of things. So water meds, different situation for off-label use than in feed. And your vets are very actively engaged with the FDA CVM. All the groups are. We've had at the AASV meetings, at the bovine practitioners, all the veterinary meetings, small ruminants. There's been numerous training sessions on this. State veterinary associations. A lot of the veterinary clinics are having their own meetings. A lot of us at K-State have had the opportunity to participate in those. They've really been good. So a lot of work's going on there. We're getting more training. I can assure you that the veterinary profession is absolutely committed to working with their clients. The FDA has said they are going to enter into this with a phased enforcement. I hear talk about they're waiting out there to lower the boom on some people right away and make really big examples. The people I'm talking to are realizing there's a lot of nuances to the application of this, a lot of them not anticipated, and so we're going to work through this together. Now, if someone's getting a type A category 1 and using it with no VFD, I doubt a phased enforcement's going to happen, because that's an egregious thumb your nose at the rules. If someone didn't quite have didn't have one address on there or something like that, we're going to work through that, okay? So it's about working through it. So this is FDA Q&A, and these were questions. Dr. Chris Rademacher from Iowa State collected these at the Swine Expo and sent them in to be answered. And so this is one. It's a common scenario here. I'll read these and we'll try to go through these. So producer A wants to feed 2 pulses of chlorotetracycline in the nursery phase, 8-week duration. So in a single group of 1,000 pigs, these get 2 weeks of CTC at the beginning, 2 weeks of CTC at the end. How many VFDs are required for this? 2, correct. Dr. Dreitz gets an A. I'll give, no. It's good. I'm so proud to see you doing so well. An animal only appears on a VFD once. So the pulsing issue is one that the FDA was not really that aware of, a lot of them. So these drugs are approved for a duration. Pulsing results in an altered duration from what is on the label. So a pulse or a repeated administration may not be authorized on a VFD. So even if only 500 pigs are going to get it, and you've got a VFD for 1,000 and you want to do 200 again, that can't be done on the same VFD. It cannot be done on the same veterinary feed directive. So as a matter of fact, the FDA uses the language, the veterinarian may reevaluate and decide that additional therapy is warranted, then a new VFD is needed, is how they put it. So I would anticipate continued evaluation of the pulsing practice. Producers buy some products from one mill and other diets or products from a second mill. Do they need a VFD for each mill, or can they write one VFD with all of the products on it? Okay, only one VFD drug per VFD. You may authorize, if cleared for concurrent use, multiple drugs to be fed with that VFD drug, but the VFD only has one VFD drug. In this case, it should be the distributor to which the veterinarian or client give the VFD should be the only distributor filling the entire order. In special circumstances, if a feed mill goes down, there may be a need for 2 mills. In this case, and here's the rest of that long deal, basically it needs a new VFD for that next mill. Right. So as a client, if you receive a paper copy of a VFD, it is not required by the FDA that the distributor be written on the VFD. Many veterinarians may choose to do that. It's possible, but it's not required. You can't take that VFD to 2 places. It's just like a prescription, okay, in that format. Now, the VFDs are technically not prescriptions. The distributors are not authorized to distribute a VFD feed under pharmacy laws. They just notify the FDA that they're going to do this, and that's how they become able to distribute those. So here's a producer that batch farrows. He'll put palmitil in the lactation feed for 21 days at 181 grams per ton. Next month, he will batch farrow again and went to put palmitil in his lactation feed. My VFD only says to feed it for 21 days at 181 grams per ton. There are no stipulations on the VFD of when the 21-day period is, so does he need another VFD each month? So this is saying a group of pigs cycle through this program repeatedly. Is there a new VFD for each cycle? And the answer is no. Up to the allowed period, you may write that VFD until the expiration date. You may authorize a certain number of pigs, and that duration of use may happen at any time during the time that VFD is in there. Same thing with a feedlot, okay? It doesn't have to be for each pen. You can anticipate the number of animals that will be receiving that drug for the label duration and authorize that use. So that's one VFD for that time period. What about the producer buying and producing his own feed on his own site? Do they need a VFD to purchase product? Do they need acknowledgement distribution letters? What is the process? So it revolves around persons, and persons are described here. They can be an entity also. So mixing feed and giving it to the pigs under your care, that's not distribution, that's feeding the feed. Once you start giving feed with a VFD drug to another person, which can be a corporation or person, then you become a distributor. So remember, you can obtain type A's, the most concentrated forms that could be up to 200x the final feed. You could obtain category 1s without a feed mill license or without a VFD. Category 1 type A's. Under no circumstances can you feed a VFD drug without a VFD in effect. To go purchase a type B premix, you must have a VFD to purchase and to use. And the veterinarian will always write the VFD for you according to the final feed that goes in front of the pigs. And with that, you may purchase the final feed from a distributor, delivered to the bin, ready to go. You may purchase a type B premix and mix it yourself with that, using the VFD to be able to purchase the type B. Or you may purchase a type A, which doesn't require the VFD, and then mix the type C according to the Veterinary Feed Directive. So you have 3 ways to get to that final feed. Your veterinarian will always write it according to what the final feed is supposed to be. So it's really important, that communication between the veterinarian, whoever's distributing the feed, and you as the client is incredibly important. Will my veterinarian have to visit every site I have to do a VFD? So to do a VFD, do they have to visit every site? Here's the FDA response. In order for a veterinarian to write a lawful VFD, the veterinarian issuing the VFD must be licensed, and that means where the animals are, operating within the course of the veterinarian's professional practice, okay, yep, and issuing the VFD in the context of a veterinarian-client-patient relationship is defined by the state. There's still, I think, 1 or 2 states where the FDA has said, we don't like your definition, we're using ours. Those will probably be fixed. And there's a link where you can go on the FDA site to determine whether it's state or federal. In our state, in Kansas, it's ours. A veterinarian would need to meet these requirements for all of the animal locations in order to issue a lawful VFD. So they're saying each location where this happens, the veterinarian's supposed to be there. It's the FDA response. How are feed delivery records going to be tied back to the VFD? Generally, the feed mill is these records, but are the producers and the veterinarians going to have the feed delivery records as well? Here's the punch line. The client and veterinarian are required to maintain the VFD record, but are not required to maintain feed delivery records under the final VFD rule. I think you'll all have those records of what you received. There was some talk around the country that the distributor would not be held responsible if the producer or the client purchased more feed than authorized by the VFD. In direct communication, written communication from the FDA, they indicated that if the client uses it other than as authorized on the VFD, they would take regulatory action against the client. If the distributor distributes more feed than is authorized in the VFD, they would take regulatory action against the distributor. Are there special provisions for how to store a VFD or feed delivery records electronically for producers or veterinarians? Does it need to be stored in an approved electronic storage system? Can a producer have the feed mill electronically store the feed delivery records that can be retrieved during an FDA audit? Producers are supposed to have the VFD record. The distributor is supposed to have one. The veterinarian is supposed to have one. They can be stored electronically. They can also be done written. And when they say Part 11 compliant, if your veterinarian is going to use one of the available electronic systems to issue the VFD for you, and you could receive it as an email, they will electronically sign that. And the way they have to do that is go through a process where they have a password that they use to affix that signature to that document, and then it is recognized as legally signed. Once that document comes to you, it's still legally signed. There was at a feed industry meeting a while back, there was a statement by an FDA representative that was a little contrary to how everyone had understood it before. They've kind of hunkered back in, and so I'm just going to stop there until we better understand exactly how some of that's going to be handled, but we'll get that out to the veterinarians as soon as some of that's settled. And that's something that happens when something as complex as this comes out, is you might get some different signals on the nuances of how this is going to be interpreted, and then you got to pull back a second and figure it out, but we'll get her done. Will there be a transition label for water-soluble products? The labels for the water-soluble products should change concurrently with the labels for the feed products. We'll switch to prescription. So even if you have 6 months supply of water-soluble product on your farm, January 1, you will need a prescription to use that. Even if it's used exactly as labeled, you'll need a prescription to use that, a VFD for any VFD feeds. How accurate do vets need to be on their pig numbers, the approximate number of animals on the VFD? The veterinarian needs to be familiar with the flow, how many pigs will be going through that site or sites that they're authorizing. And, you know, some overage is okay, so that if you end up with a little more coming through the nursery this month, it doesn't matter. If you ride it for 10 times, they'd probably wonder what you're doing, because you can legally purchase the amount of feed or products to create that feed that's on the VFD. And obviously it wouldn't do any of us any good to have a whole lot of that just sitting around. Clarifying the producer-owned feed mill situation. Does a producer need a distributor letter or a VFD? Does it matter if all the pigs are on the mill site? Does it matter if the producer owns sites away from his farm, or if these sites are contract finisher sites, even though he owns all of the pigs? The way it works is, if you are feeding pigs under your care, you're a client, you have the VFD, you're feeding those animals. Even if you do not own the animals, if you're feeding them and they're under your care, that's a VFD. If you're mixing that and distributing that feed to another entity or person, then, and those pigs are owned separate and cared for separate, someone else is responsible for the care and feeding, now you become a distributor. A letter of acknowledgement is one that a distributor sends to the person who is providing them the VFD feed, that says, we'll only sell this to someone with a valid veterinary feed directive, and we won't sell it to them unless they give us the VFD, and we'll have the VFD. The letter of intent goes to the FDA that you're going to distribute. So for a producer who mills their own feed for their own sites, do they need a VFD to purchase the bulk product from an animal health company? What is their procedure to bring products in? So if it is a type B, the premix, or a type C feed, you must have a VFD to purchase. You will provide a copy. That copy of that VFD will be provided to the distributor. You'll have a VFD to use. If it's a type A, you may purchase and possess. If it's a category 1, if you're not licensed, if you happen to be a licensed feed mill, you can purchase category 1 or 2A, type A, the most concentrated form. They say in here they would expect your inventory of type A, category 1 on site, if you're a non-licensed feed mill, to be commensurate with your anticipated use. And if you want to get down into exactly what that means, I've got the answer in the trunk of my car, and I'll be selling that for $50 after we're done here. I don't know. One-time distributor letter and acknowledgement letter. Unless you plan on being a distributor, the acknowledgement letter and the letters of intent don't apply to you. Those are only for distributors, and telling the FDA they're going to distribute, assuring the person that's going to sell the VFD drug to them to sell to you that they're only going to sell it to you if you have a VFD. So unless you get into that, not a big issue. So this does involve you. A producer has a VCPR with a veterinary clinic with 5 veterinarians. Can any of the veterinarians write a VFD for them then? The FDA's interpretation of that is that a VCPR exists with the veterinarian and the client. They're quick to say that that is where their VFD definition applies. Within the state may have another definition of how that applies, and that's the regulation of the practice of veterinary medicine. So those are some of the questions. I think we're about 2 minutes early from when we wanted to ask some questions.
We open it up for a few questions for Dr. Apley here.
We've got 30 seconds for questions.
And we get
I don't see any hands. I guess we're done. Don't see any hands. Okay.
Dr. Henry.
Yes.
That was easy. Let's try the next part.
Let's stop there.
I always really like it
Even though a VFD is not required, and I can't quote the label on that, if there is a defined duration of feeding, whether or not it is a VFD drug, you must adhere to the duration of feeding, because that's the label.
What about indication? Do I have to have dysentery or salmonella in order to get carbodoxin?
Yeah, the prohibition of extra label use for feed drugs is not restricted just to VFD drugs. That applies to all feed drugs.
But Carbodox is labeled for growth promotion.
No, the growth promotion for Carbodox will stay because it's not a medically important antibiotic.
Got it. It's not on the medically important list. So we can continue to use it at growth promoting levels because that label will not change.
Yeah, and so that's a good point. The growth promotion uses are only being taken away from the medically important ones, not the ones that aren't classified as medically important. There's one on there.
One question there that I have is Tiamulin, Denagard. Is that label going to change?
So Denagard right now is not medically important. Our list of medically important antibiotics was created by CDER, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, on the human side in about 2000 and was released about 2001. It has not been revisited during that time. Since then, over in Europe, there have been 2 versions of the pleuromutilins, which is the class for Tiamulin or Denagard, which are orally active against methicillin-resistant Staph aureus in humans, and they're approved. So when you look at the World Health Organization, Denagard is now a medically important antibiotic. I do not have information. This is definitely going to happen, but the FDA has said they do need to revisit that list, and due to that circumstance, it is possible, not guaranteed, that there would be a change of status for that drug from non-medically important to medically important. How's that for a 4-minute answer?
Just to clarify, on January 1
It's
of
not medically
2017, that label is not going to change.
Correct. It's not medically important in the
But
United
is there a
States.
growth promotion label on Tiamulin?
I can't spit that out.
I don't think there is a growth promoting label on Tiamulin, so when it comes down to the label, you got to use it as label. So we're not going to be able to use Tiamulin as a growth promotant, but we can use it without a VFD for treatment. Okay, Dr. Henry.
Okay, you got in the mill, come the first year, I got a stack of Thailand over here, I got a stack of CTC over here. Those labels are not going to be congruent with the new label.
Correct.
So I must use those in accordance with the new label, but I can still use them, correct?
Correct. Correct. And I'm not texting someone out of rudeness. I'm looking up the Denagard label, sir.
All right,
I'm-
an easy question from the feed mill.
So I do have a veterinarian that likes to pulse, and so if they are sending pulses, will each VFD have, since I have to have a new VFD for each pulse, will it have a unique number, or how will I know if I have multiple VFDs for the same group of pigs?
Okay.
Will they have unique, kind of track that back?
So the question was about how in the world would the feed mill track which VFDs for which pulse, et cetera. It's not required that you label those, but within additional information, it would be wise to label those for second administration or second pulse to the pigs in this unit, or that this VFD covers. So the sites would be listed. And a veterinarian has the ability on a veterinary feed directive to list sites. They can go down to individual animal if they want to. They can do individual animal, they can do pins within a place, they can specify certain things. So it would be best to work with the veterinarian to have those labeled so you knew. And then, so is that truckload of feed I see raising dust down the road, is that, did that go for Pulse 1 to this barn or Pulse 2 to this barn? There'll be some interesting situations with that. Yes. I like yours a lot better than Henry's, so we can go all day.
So from a distributor standpoint, you kept mentioning they couldn't give more feed than was on now on. There's not going to be a feed. So how do you know if a farm orders say, I want 3 tons of feed,
Okay, so good question. How does the distributor know that? So the veterinarian actually only has to specify gram per ton. So they can say 5,000 animals, 400 grams per ton, this indication, this duration. The producer brings that to the distributor or the mill. You guys are going to have to sit down and decide how much that is. So what this did, and I love you too, I read your lips, all right? The VFD is this new VFD rule said, okay, we're going to make it easier. The vets no longer have to put on there how much feed that means. What they meant was, hey, distributors, you get to figure out how much. Now, we did lobby for that. I think we went to DC and lobbied. Actually, we didn't. So they took it off the veterinarian, but the distributor is going to have to say, okay, they're doing that in the nursery. Those pigs are eating this much of this ration. So, for example, the one issue where they had the pulse, the 2 weeks at the start and the end of the nursery, okay, that's going to be a different amount of feed for those 2 times, right? Because it's going to be a duration. That grams per ton is going to be a different amount of feed that they can legally get under those 2. So now, if you write a VFD and they are going to put this in the feed according to a protocol, see, and it's not really going to happen in pigs that way. We've got a challenge on the feedlot side that, see, we feed twice a day, so we can put it in next feeding through the micro machine. So if I authorize CTC at a gram per 100 for 5 days, if that's done to them when they're 500 pounds or when they're 700, all of a sudden it's a totally different amount of feed. And so it'd be a different grams per ton to achieve a gram per 100 pounds of body weight per day. So one of our questions from the beef side is, can we put a range of grams per ton dependent on body weight? And we're waiting for that response. But it is, and that's why I put in that point that the FDA has said if the distributor distributes more feed than authorized on that VFD, then the FDA would take enforcement action against that distributor. So that puts the mills and the distributors in an awkward position. The veterinarian is expected to provide a valid VFD. The distributor is expected to only distribute on the order of a valid VFD. So if they come in from an electronic format, the only way, minus a bug or an error which would be fixed, they can escape that electronic format and get to a mill and a producer is for them to meet the legal requirements, because you have drop-down lists. Handwrittens, the ones I've seen from companies for products, they have the indications on there and the associated regimens, so you can check those off. We are very strongly encouraging veterinarians to not create their own forms.
That would be real interesting, huh?
You have to decide how much they're going to feed the pigs. Yeah. Yes, sir.
To add on to your point, so from the feed manufacturer standpoint, then, so would be fairly maybe good at determining feed intake at a certain phase. So now we're talking about what the feed manufacturer would have to predict a pathogen challenge feed intake on these animals. So they would be in a position to have quite a bit of variance on there.
Yes. What should happen if people aren't going to abuse it is the way that can be handled is make sure there's plenty of pigs on that VFD. Don't write it for double, but if it's going to be 500 pigs going through this and you're writing it for, if you put it for 500, you're asking for catastrophe if those pigs start to eat more than anticipated or whatever. If you give a little leeway, there's room for consumption, because then they can buy as much feed as that, and then you go back and look at what they consume. So that's a question with the FDA of what kind of variance would be allowed, up 10% or whatever. And there's also questions about loads. you know, there's a 12-ton load shows up and the bin only holds 10, what are we supposed to do? And there's a lot of those things that are going to require some common sense in working them through. Because when this was written, good people tried to do their best to write them, but the understanding of what you know about the variances of sick or healthy pigs and variations in weather and stuff like that was way beyond the concepts that were in when they wrote these things. So I think we'll work through those, and it's really good for me to hear those things, because when we're talking to them, we bring those things up. And someone shy like Dr. Henry might not feel comfortable bringing those up, and so I'll do it, yeah.
All right.
Two.
Dr. Henry, you got two more. Okay.
Okay, it's fall, and we really struggle with these first six and then are going in the past. Well, we've always done 400 grams of CTC plus 35 grams of Veterinary. That's what we've run in there for 2 weeks. So can I write, if my veterinarian write, a VFD for the CTC and then mix the Denigard in with that? That's a medically important one that doesn't require VFD?
So the veterinarian has to authorize that, but yes, you can, if they're being fed. And so concurrent clearances, the concurrent clearance isn't for any CTC and any Denigard. The concurrent clearance are for, so everyone understands, there's specific dose inclusion combinations. So as long as you meet that, veterinarian has 3 options. I authorize no other feeds to be fed with this, or feed drugs, only this one. I authorize these specific ones, list them, or I authorize anything which may be legally fed with this to be fed with it. So you can do that, you know.
One last.
Okay, let me record you saying that, because they want to hold that.
Now, this comes out of a meeting in Iowa a couple weeks ago where Iowa investigator for state of Iowa explained to everybody what they were going to do in Iowa to investigate. And most of it made sense, but he made it pretty clear that in Iowa, a feed mill delivering feed to a farm is by Iowa law to deliver invoices. You know those old big pieces
Oh, yeah. This,
that you float into the bulk tank before all over.
and half of them go down the road. And,
He says that feed distributor under VFDs, if it contains a VFD drug, that should be on that sheet of paper. And he expects to see that with the producer's copy of the VFD when he does an inspection.
So what he's saying is the feed records, he's expecting to see the producer maintaining feed delivery records. Exactly, yeah.
Make that so we can audit it back to the mill.
he was, my understanding, Steve, when I heard that, he was
Okay.
expecting it to be at both locations, being able to track it at the farm and at the feed mill. And his definition was it must be producible within 24 hours, wasn't it?
So that's one. So what needs to happen is that question and all the nuances around it needs, and Chris up at ISU, Rademacher, what's his name? He's the one I understand is collecting a lot of these and shipping them in. For consistency's sake, we need to document everything that was said, all of that, and put it in so we can get the head shed commenting on it. And along with that, an explanation of where that creates a wreck so that they understand. And I have never done a VFD meeting, and I've done a few now, where I have not had to send in a question to the FDA to clarify.